Okay, so today we're diving deep into a language I think a lot of people are curious about, Danish.
Yeah.
And I'll admit I'm kind of in that boat of like I don't know much about it other than like, people ask, "Oh, is it like Swedish?"
Yeah.
So we're going to get into all of that today, but I think there's
Okay.
a lot more to it
Oh, tons more. Yeah.
than
Yeah.
just that.
Yeah. Danish is really fascinating.
Yeah.
And you're right to sort of look beyond that surface level
Yeah.
comparison because there's a lot that makes it really unique.
Yeah.
So I think a good place to start with any language is just like, where do we find it? Like,
Okay.
where are people speaking it?
Right. Yeah.
So obviously Denmark, that's a given.
Right.
But the materials mention that it pops up in some maybe surprising places.
That's right. Yeah, I noticed that too. It's like more than just Denmark.
Yeah. Yeah. So beyond Denmark, you've got Greenland,
Okay.
the Faroe Islands,
Wow.
parts of northern Germany even.
Really?
Yeah, it's kind of this footprint of history.
Well, language travels.
Wow.
And Greenland especially, I think, is an interesting case.
Yeah, what's the story there? Because I was kind of curious about that when I was reading through the materials.
Yeah, so you could really think about colonization there.
Okay.
Danish kind of took root in Greenland through their influence. And while Greenlandic is definitely prominent today,
Yeah.
Danish is still widely used.
Wow.
It's this legacy effect. And I think it just shows how intertwined
Yeah.
language and human movement are.
Yeah, it's like linguistic DNA in a way.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, and speaking of connections across time,
Mm-hmm.
we were talking about Danish today, and it has this ancestor, right? This Old Norse ancestor.
Yeah.
How did it go from that?
Right.
We think of Viking raids and things like that. How do you go from that to what we hear today when we hear Danish?
Yeah, well, you can just kind of imagine a language evolving over centuries.
It's like branches on a tree. And Danish went through some major vowel shifts.
Okay.
So those sounds morphing over time.
Right.
And that's a big part of why it sounds so distinct now.
Okay. And nestled within all of that is this thing called the stud
Yes.
that the materials mentioned.
Yeah, the stud is very cool.
What is that?
So the stud is almost like Danish's secret sonic weapon.
Okay.
It's this tiny, almost like a guttural stop
Okay.
in some words.
Mhm.
But here's the thing, it can completely change the word's meaning.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
Just this tiny sound?
Just this tiny sound can make all the difference.
Wow.
So, for example, you can take the words bunder
Okay.
and bunner.
Blender and bunner.
Yeah, so spelled almost the same, but bunder with the stud means peasants.
Oh.
And bunner without, it means beams.
Wow.
Yeah. So that one sound just redraws the entire image for you.
That's wild.
Yeah.
No wonder linguists love Danish.
It's really cool.
If it has things like that in it.
Yeah.
But it's not just internal changes,
Yeah.
right? Like we've been talking about.
Yeah.
What about other languages that have influenced Danish?
Yeah.
Because I know the materials mentioned Low German quite a bit.
Yes, Low German is a huge player in Danish vocabulary.
Okay.
Get this. 100 of the 500 most common Danish words have Low German roots.
100 out of 500.
100 out of 500.
That's a lot.
That's a significant chunk of their everyday vocabulary.
Why Low German, though?
Yeah, that's a good question.
That seems kind of random.
It does seem random, but if you look back to the Middle Ages,
Okay.
you had the Hanseatic League, which was this powerful trading group, and they used Low German.
Okay.
And guess who was right in the mix?
I'm going to guess Denmark?
Denmark, exactly.
Okay.
So, language follows power, it follows trade routes.
So it's like those everyday words that Danish people are using today have this whole, history
Exactly.
woven into them.
Yeah, it's really cool.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
What about English?
Ooh.
Because it feels like English is kind of infiltrating everything these days.
Yeah, it's true.
So I have to imagine that Danish is not immune to that.
No language is immune to the influence of English.
Right.
And its influence is much more recent.
Okay.
Really picking up speed after World War II.
Okay.
Think movies, music, the internet.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
It's everywhere. And Danish, like many languages, is adapting
Yeah.
by absorbing some of that
Right.
influence.
Yeah. So it's like Danish has picked up all these influences
Yeah.
along the way.
Mhm.
But I have a question for you.
Yeah.
And this is one that I always kind of wonder about when it comes to
Yeah.
languages that are sort of related.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you speak Danish,
Yeah.
can you understand Swedish?
Ah, that is the million kroner question, isn't it?
Right.
And, the materials use this term, mutual intelligibility,
Right.
which sounds very promising.
It does.
But the reality is it's complicated.
Okay, how so?
Well, think of it like this.
Go ahead.
It's kind of a spectrum.
Okay.
Norwegians are kind of the pros.
Okay.
They tend to understand both Danish and Swedish pretty well.
Okay.
But for Danes and Swedes, it's a bit more one-sided.
So who has the easier time?
It seems like Swedes have a slightly easier time with Danish.
Really?
Yeah. And geography plays a role there.
Okay.
Norway sits right between Denmark and Sweden.
Right.
So they've historically been exposed to more of both.
Right.
Plus, Danish actually had a big influence on written Norwegian.
Ah.
So there were some vocabulary links there.
So it's almost like Danish is this distant cousin that Swedish can kind of make out.
Yeah.
But Norwegian's the sibling that they talk to all the time.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it's a good way to put it.
Well, what about, I want to get into some of the grammar.
Yes.
Because I know Danish has some quirks.
It does. It has some good ones.
Let's start with plurals.
Okay.
Because in English, it's pretty straightforward.
Right.
Like you just add an "es" or an "es" for the most part.
Right, most of the time. What about Danish?
So Danish likes to keep things interesting.
Okay.
They have all these different noun classes.
Okay.
And each one has its own plural ending.
Oh, wow. So it's not just like adding one thing on.
Not at all. No.
Okay.
Sometimes it's "er," sometimes it's "e,"
Okay.
sometimes it's nothing at all.
Wow.
And just to make it even more fun, the vowels in the word can change too.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, my God.
So, for example, "fode," which means foot,
Okay.
becomes "fudder" for feet.
Fudder.
Yeah.
Okay.
So a little different.
Yeah, just a little bit.
A little tricky.
The materials also mention something about 2.5 genders.
Right. Yes. I know it sounds more complicated than it is.
Okay.
So like many languages, they have common and neuter genders.
Okay.
However, some dialects hold on to these remnants of a third gender.
Which kind of muddies the grammatical waters a bit.
It's like you can see the evolution right there in the grammar.
You really can.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Out of all the quirks, though,
Yeah.
what would you say is like the most particularly Danish?
Ooh, that's a good question.
The most surprising, maybe?
I think for me, it's the definite article as a suffix.
What does that mean?
So it trips up a lot of learners,
Okay.
but it's so elegantly Danish.
Okay.
So in English, you would say the house.
Right.
In Danish, it's huset.
Huset.
Yeah, so you see that little 8 at the end?
Yeah.
That's your definite article built right in
Oh, wow.
to the word itself.
Oh, it's not even its own word?
It's not a separate word, no.
It's like the word itself is saying, I am the house.
Exactly. I am the house.
Not just any house.
Yeah, this is it.
Wow. Is that common in other languages?
Danish definitely makes it its own.
Okay.
You'll find similar structures in other Scandinavian languages and even beyond.
Okay.
It's just one more quirk that gives Danish its very distinct flavor.
Well, speaking of distinct, we have to talk about the numbers.
Oh, yes, the numbers.
Because the materials mentioned, they get a little wild.
They get a little wild.
Tell us about that.
So things start to get interesting after 50.
Okay.
Danish uses a system called vigesimal,
Vigesimal.
which basically means it's based on multiples of 20.
The multiples of 20.
Multiples of 20.
Instead of 10 like we're used to.
Instead of 10 like we're used to in English.
Wow.
So, for example, 50 in Danish is halvtræds,
Halvtræd.
which translates roughly to half-third times 20.
Wait, so to get to 50,
Yeah.
they're thinking 2 20s
You got it.
plus half of a 20.
Exactly.
That's some next level math.
It's like a little word puzzle
It is.
to get to the number.
That's
And
amazing.
you'd be surprised this base 20 system, it
Yeah.
pops up in other languages too.
Really?
Yeah, like French has these
wow.
little echoes of it.
That's so interesting.
It just shows how language preserves these little pieces of history, these glimpses into how people used to think about things.
Like a hidden message from the past.
Yeah, exactly.
That's amazing.
so cool.
Well, and speaking of ways to represent things,
Yeah.
what about just like the written language?
Oh, yeah.
Is it the same alphabet as English?
So they share most of it,
Okay.
but they've got a few extra characters up their sleeve.
Like what?
They've got A, which we've heard in some of the words.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
they've got A and O.
And those are all their own letters.
Those are their own separate vowels, each with a distinct sound.
Of course they are.
Of course they are.
So, Danish got to have a few extra vowels.
We've got to have a few extra vowels.
The materials mentioned a spelling reform, though, in 1948.
Yes.
What was that all about?
So that's when they officially adopted the ul.
Okay.
Before that, they used a to represent essentially the same sound.
Why change it then?
Well, language reforms, they often aim to standardize and simplify. Okay.
So adopting ul kind of brought Danish more in line with Norwegian and Swedish writing systems.
Okay.
Of course, language is very tied to identity.
Right.
And not everyone was thrilled about the change.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's hard to let go of those things.
It is.
Speaking of pushing back against change,
Yeah.
the materials mention a city, Aalborg.
Aalborg. Yeah.
What's their deal? So they're like the one holdout.
They're like, we're sticking with A. Thank you very much.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's this really great example of how, language is about more than just rules on a page.
Right.
It's about identity.
Mm-hmm.
It's about tradition.
Yeah.
It's about local pride.
Totally.
And that A is like their badge of honor.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to me as we've been talking about this.
Yeah.
How much is packed into language?
I know, it's amazing.
Like we've got Viking echoes.
Right.
We've got borrowed words from all over the place.
Mhm.
We've got counting systems that are like these puzzles you have to figure out. Right. And they all sort of come together to shape how we experience the world.
That's what I was thinking. Like, do you think,
Yeah.
I don't know, take the stead.
Yeah.
Do you think that little burst of air
Yeah.
influences like the musicality of Danish?
Totally.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes you wonder, right?
It does. It does.
Yeah.
Or how about like those compound words that Danish is famous for?
Yeah.
Where they're just like stringing together these long.
Like a pearl necklace of words.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Could that reflect like a different way of thinking about how ideas connect to each other?
I mean, those are such fascinating questions. And it's hard to say for sure.
Right.
But it really makes you appreciate how language might shape thought.
Yeah.
And just like we were saying earlier, it's the lens through which we view the world.
So if you're listening and you've ever thought about like, oh, maybe you'll dabble in Danish.
Yeah.
It's not just about memorizing vocabulary.
Right.
It's not just about the grammar rules.
It's about opening yourself up to a whole different way of seeing things.
Yeah. Exactly. And I think that's what I love about learning about languages.
Me too.
Is it's like you get these little glimpses into other cultures.
Absolutely.
So we've really journeyed through the history of Danish.
We have. It's been quite a ride.
We've uncovered some of its hidden connections.
Yeah, so many layers.
We grappled with its counting system.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around half treads.
But you know what the real adventure begins? When you start listening to it.
Absolutely.
When you can hear those sounds.
Yeah.
And feel that rhythm.
Yeah, and who knows what you'll discover about the language and maybe even about yourself along the way.
That's a great place to end it.
I think so.